Good evening. Welcome to Astrologer Climate Witness tonight. I have at least one article, possibly a second, that I'm going to be reading. The first one is by Richard Heinberg, and he has been writing about energy and its consequences, the reality of it, for decades, I imagine. The name of this is Can Civilization Survive? These studies might tell us. Okay, I not only will read these, but I might be adding something at the end. So why am I doing this according to astrology tonight? Okay, again, I bring up the whole Pluto and Capricorn thing. Capricorn, resources of the earth, okay, and how we use them, because it's an earth sign. One of the key words for Capricorn is I use, correct? So, I read this many years ago. So, with Pluto there, we are supposed to have learned not just this cycle of Pluto through Capricorn, but many other cycles of Pluto through Capricorn, how to use the resources of the earth without destroying the earth. Okay? But we haven't learned that. Not by a long shot. We were supposed to have learned this long before we discovered fossil fuels. And we did not. Once we found fossil fuels, we went full bore into death mode. And if you don't believe me, you haven't been paying attention. You think that because of the, quote, progress that man has made by medicines and structures that they've built and empires that they've built, that we are using our resources positively. Well, we are not, because as we're doing all these things, the overall consequence, no matter how much medicine we make to cure everyone, or how many, structures we build for people to be in, we are actually destroying the planet under our feet and killing our biosphere that keeps us alive. 69% of all wildlife has been killed off since 1970. What does that tell you? Okay, I'm going to start reading. Again, by Richard Heinberg, Can Civilization Survive? These studies might tell us. The world's shift away from its current reliance on fossil fuels will be the biggest, most expensive, and most complex technical project ever attempted by humans. If it fails, that might mean the end of industrial civilization. For it to succeed, enormous amounts of investment and effort, along with some shared sacrifice, will be required. These are the conclusions of key recent studies attempting to model the global energy transition. Now, he doesn't mention in this first paragraph that what's also required is raping the shit out of the planet. He does sort of, and the studies say that as we go along, but, it would have been nice if he'd have put it in the beginning. Okay. Energy is essential. It's what enables us to do literally anything and everything we do. Fossil fuels, with their ability to store and deliver enormous amounts of energy, underpin the modern industrial world. But since fossil fuels are finite and polluting, it's imperative that we plan a shift to renewable energy systems that can be sustained over long term. Okay, you know where I stand on renewables. I think I've mentioned many times, but they do piece this out as they go along. Come on, kitty, get down, get down. Hold on one second. So as we continue, like I said, these two studies that they've done on two different models of our energy transition, they do sort out various takes on the use of resources for the transition. Okay, now, a transition away from fossil fuels is not optional. In some form or another, it is inevitable. However, this is in order to keep industrial civilization alive, and it's in order to keep billions of people from dying. Okay, that's why it's inevitable. Okay, but if we do it wrong, which we will, billions of people are going to die anyway. However, there are serious questions about how much it will cost in terms of money, energy, and emissions, how fast we can accomplish it, and what kind of society can be supported by the alternative energy sources we adopt. Presumably, a suite of sources dominated by solar and wind power. Now, I'm going to say something. I looked up recently how many windmills or wind turbines would be necessary to build in order to, just the wind turbines, in order to make a 100% transition to renewables. Just in wind turbines, it would be 3.5 million. Okay? 3.5 million wind turbines. And they have a footer, which is made of cement. That is massive. And I forget the dimensions right now, but it's huge. Okay, let me continue. These questions have political and economic dimensions, but relying on politics or economics to guide the transition would be foolish without first analyzing the options and their physical world implications. Otherwise, politicians and economists will just try to maintain our current industrial system as much as possible. Okay, there's that. Even though this system is inherently unsustainable due to the fact that it depends overwhelmingly on depleting fossil fuels and is generating cascading crises via climate change. Trained analysts are using computer-based models to gauge what the energy transition will mean and how it can be best accomplished. But so far, transition modeling has received remarkably little attention from policymakers or the general public. What we need to know. The first efforts toward energy transition modeling mostly estimated how many solar panels and wind turbines would be needed to replace the energy we currently derive from fossil fuels and how much all of that technology would cost. But the energy transition will be a far more complex task than just building new energy generators. Because solar and wind power are intermittent, energy storage will be required, along with more redundancy in generating capacity. So in one area, the wind might not be blowing for a while, so then there has to be another area to pick up on that generating of power because there's more wind. It could be 50 miles apart. I don't know. There's something along those lines, what they mean by the redundancy. Because most of the new energy sources will produce electricity, while most current energy usage infrastructure is designed for storable fuels. We'll have to electrify a great deal of energy using technology. Electric cars are just the start. At the same time, we'll need a whole new industry to make low-carbon fuels for technologies, I want to really laugh right now, that will be hard to electrify, like cement kilns and airplanes. Oh, they're working on it. Like we have all the time in the world. Again, I say, why wait for these technologies, which we don't have yet? All we've had to do is cut our frivolous activities and products and get rid of them. We could have done that 10, 15, 20 years ago. We would have reduced emissions immediately, practically. But no, they would rather say, we're working on this technology, we're working on that technology, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. Meanwhile, we're still increasing emissions. And the concentration never goes down. It continues to be added to. So why haven't we done the degrowth or the cutting out of completely unnecessary and frivolous stuff in our civilization, which would have completely immediately reduced emissions by what? 20%, 25, 50%? We could have gotten rid of so much. Of course, that would require rearranging our economy. You're not going to be able to have people living off casinos, and you're not going to be able to have people living off professional sports as a career. I'm sorry, but the planet is dying. So what the hell are we doing? Really, it's beyond me. It's beyond me. It's because the leaders we have want to keep power and they want to keep their money. It's mostly their power, which gives them their money. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me continue. Okay, let me bring it back. The field of systems dynamics is ideally suited to energy transition analysis, since its practitioners aim to model changing complex systems. System dynamics studies often produce several possible scenarios, with each scenario based on the adjustment of a key variable. With regard to the energy transition, we need system dynamics scenario studies that can answer the following questions. 1. How much will the transition cost monetarily? Not just for panels and wind turbines, but for the system as a whole, including the new electrified infrastructure, along with the infrastructure needed for energy storage and the production of low carbon fuels. Pipe dream. How much energy will it take? This is number 2. Building all this new infrastructure will take energy. In the early phases of the transition, most of that energy will come from fossil fuels, which supply over 80% of global energy currently. What about carbon emissions? Number 3. During the energy transition, society will be emitting more greenhouse gases than it would otherwise, in parentheses, due to ramped up industrial processes needed to build out the energy infrastructure. How much more? How will the transition affect economic growth and vice versa? If the global economy continues to grow, that might make the transition harder, as more energy would be required for non-transition purposes. But deliberately contracting the economy in order to direct more energy toward the transition might erode financial and political support for the project. You think? People aren't going to go for degrowth. Yeah, that's because they don't understand, and purposely it's been done for them to not understand. All we had to do was develop a major educational program, which our whole educational system could have been wrapped around the whole concept of environmental protection and environmental emphasis, instead of wrapping our whole educational system around, oh, you have to make as much money as possible in the world in order to exist. Doesn't matter how you did it. Doesn't matter that you're going to be using very degrading and inefficient and destructive methods in order to make a living, which is really make a death. Let's face it. You don't realize that while you're making a living with your paycheck, you're destroying the living for your children and grandchildren. They won't have that living as time goes on. And you don't believe it. I know, most people don't, until you start to try to understand the science behind all this. People have a tendency to hate science these days, but guess what? You're going to love it eventually, but it'll be too late. How will the transition impact society's return on the energy it invests in getting more energy, energy return on energy invested, or EROI? It is the high energy profit ratios of fossil fuels that have enabled humanity to construct complex industrial societies in which the great majority of people spend their days using energy rather than producing it. In other words, instead of producing your own food from your own garden, that's your energy you produce, the food from that garden, you're depending on some other energy to make money. EROI for fossil fuels is generally declining due to the depletion of high-quality stocks of oil, gas, and coal, while EROI for renewables is generally increasing due to the technology improvements. That won't last. But the situation is complicated. During the transition, energy costs will come earlier than the energy paybacks, thereby possibly lowering the EROI for society as a whole, at least temporarily. It won't be temporary. And EROI for renewables would decline due to the depletion of mineral and metal ores needed to build these technologies at scale, in parentheses, since it takes more energy to mine and refine low-grade ores. All right, I'm going to read that again. And the EROI for renewables could decline due to the depletion of mineral and metal ores needed to build these technologies at scale, and in parentheses, since it takes more energy to mine and refine lower grade ores. Okay, another bullet. How will the transition be impacted by material scarcity? The construction of solar panels and wind turbines, batteries, and other renewable energy technologies at scale will require enormous amounts of metals and minerals, some of which are already scarce. What are the costs and benefits if the transition goes faster or slower? The speed of the transition could have varying impacts on the economy, on energy availability, on societal EROI, and the greenhouse emissions. Clearly, there's a lot that we need to know. And adding further to the complexity, we can't just address each of these questions independently because all of the parts of the energy system and the industrial system it powers will be constantly interacting. That's why we need scenarios based on dynamic systems modeling. Interest in energy transition modeling is fairly recent, but the academic literature is growing quickly. Dozens of relevant research papers have been published in the past decade, though most attempt to answer just one or two of the questions listed above. For example, a report by McKinsey Consultants estimated that the global transition will cost $275 trillion over 30 years. That report was criticized here, and that's in blue, and you could click the here and find out what they have to say. A full discussion of all these publications would be unwieldy, especially since many do not employ systems dynamic methodology. Instead, let's survey just two recent system dynamics studies that address many of the questions I've posed. One study's conclusions are more gloomy and the other less so. The first one, dynamic energy return. The first study is dynamic energy return on energy invested, or EROI, and material requirements and scenarios of global transition to renewable energies. And they give a bunch of names here, but I'll put this on so you can read it, who it is. Below, I'll refer to the study simply as dynamic energy return. The dynamic energy return team of scientists focused on EROI, energy return on investment, because they believe it will be the key to the outcome of the energy transition. If societal EROI is high during and after the transition, that means energy will be easier to obtain. And with more plentiful and cheaper energy, other problems will be easier to solve. For example, cheap energy could enable the processing of lower grade mineral and metal ores in larger quantities, thereby making it cheaper to manufacture renewable energy components and install infrastructure. However, if societal EROI declines, most industrial and economic problems become harder to solve, whether they involve manufacturing or resource acquisition. This study's findings are worrisome. Currently, according to the authors, the world gains 12 units of energy for every unit of energy invested in producing energy, via, in parentheses, via drilling oil wells, mining coal, building nuclear power plants, manufacturing and installing solar panels, and so on. A nearly full transition of global energy system by 2060 would reduce that payback to between 3 and 5 units. The authors note this is if you went to renewables, you're going to get 3 to 5 units instead of 12 units for every unit invested. Okay? The authors note that previous research suggests that an energy profit ratio in the range of 3 to 1 to 5 to 1 could not sustain the operation of modern industrial societies. Okay, so let that sink in. Societal EROI would decline partly because of the increased need for energy to build out new energy infrastructure. Even though the new energy generators would be producing more energy over their lifetimes than would be expended in building them, energy invested would come first, while energy payback would be achieved over years or decades. Therefore, a fast transition means that the EROI of the energy system as a whole would decline, at least until after the transition is mostly finished. Moreover, the production of energy would need to increase by 35% in order to supply the same level of net energy to society during this transition. So the production of energy would need to increase now by 35% in order to supply the same level of net energy to society during the transition. Drill, baby, drill. The dynamic energy return study also found that greater requirement for raw materials could drive a substantial rematerialization of the economy. The authors estimate that cumulative demand would surpass current mineral reserves for tellurium, indium, tin, silver, and gallium. And those are just a few because I've read other studies that include copper, cobalt, all that kind of stuff. The implications of the study are startling. If society pursues a fast transition away from fossil fuels and toward renewable energy alternatives while attempting to maintain current levels of energy usage for other purposes, agriculture, manufacturing, building, heating and cooling, road and building construction, and transportation, energy systems will be strained, possibly to the breaking point. Indeed, under conditions of the declining EROI and resource scarcity, the transition might fail, and the industrial societies might find it difficult to stave off collapse. Okay, energy requirements. The second study, energy requirements and carbon emissions for a low carbon energy transition. Again, I'll put this on and this is from Nature Communications, that's the publication, okay? Partly confirming the dynamic energy return results, the authors of Energy Requirements found that the initial push for a transition is likely to cause a 10 to 34% decline in net energy available to society. Again, these authors found societal EROI to be a key metric in modeling the transition. Indeed, this study was structured around three scenarios: high, medium, and low EROI. The energy transition's cost and difficulty increased significantly as the assumed EROI declined. Energy Requirements also investigated the cumulative carbon emissions associated with the transition to a low carbon energy system and found that they will likely be substantial, ranging from 70 to almost 400 billion tons of CO2, depending on the scenario. For comparison, today's global carbon emissions clock in at about 50 billion tons per year. By 2050, if society pursues a rapid transition, activities associated with building, operating, and replacing energy generators will produce over 2.5 times the percentage share of society's overall carbon emissions as compared with today's fossil-dominated energy system. That seems counterintuitive. However, for the current energy system, the authors are counting mainly emissions from drilling and mining, but not the burning of the fuels as they are produced, as though emissions are associated with other economic sectors, in parentheses, agriculture, transportation, manufacturing. So when they're counting the emissions from oil companies and gas and coal, they don't count the burning of that. They just count the emissions from drilling and mining and blah, 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 blah. Okay, like that really makes sense, right? This finding means that if society's overall emissions are to stay within the budget permissible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which we're already past that, the rest of society in parentheses, sectors other than the energy industry, will have to reduce emissions, perhaps effectively to zero. How this could be accomplished for sectors such as aviation and the steel and cement industries is barely imaginable. I can't figure it out. Unless we figure out how to reinvent many key industrial processes, they'll simply have to be significantly downsized. I like that idea. Again, making cement is the most CO2 producing activities that humans do. And look how much cement there is in the world. China, let me see if I can get this right from what I remember reading recently. China has made more cement in the last, is it 10 years or 20? I think it's 20 years than the United States has made since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I think I have those dates right. Maybe it's the United States made since 1950 or something. But anyway, China's got us beat at this point in making cement. And guess what? We're running out of sand. For those who are not used to this information, that's going to sound really crazy, isn't it? But it takes a particular kind of sand to make cement. And every time you take take sand from, say, a beach bank or somewhere else, you're destroying that ecosystem. You're destroying the banks on the ocean front that protect communities or protect wetlands, protect ecosystems of animals and such, and habitats for animals. Every time we try to do some industrialized mass scale thing, we're killing ourselves and everything else with it. And this is what people can't wrap their minds around. They don't know this. They don't think about it. It's not in the front of their mind. And even once they are presented with the information, they're kind of in denial. Okay. The conclusions of energy requirements are relatively optimistic in its high EROI scenario. The reduction in society EROI during the transition is modest, and the jump in emissions is relatively small. Moreover, the authors conclude, a good life could be achieved at a lower per capita energy use by improving efficiency of energy using technologies, in parentheses, by replacing gasoline-powered cars with electric cars, by shifting from consumption choices with higher energy intensities to choices with lower energy intensities, and from cars to bicycles, in other words, and by avoiding the most inefficient alternatives altogether, flying. That part's very, very true. I like that. Comparing two studies, what can we learn? Controversy within the community of energy transition modelers largely boils down to the differing assumptions about current and future EROI figures for renewable energy sources. In the research literature, some studies suggest that the overall energy return for renewables is far lower than that for fossil fuels, while other studies find the energy return for solar and wind to be somewhat higher than for oil currently. These differences in EROI estimates stem largely from the design differences of the studies. Some studies count only the most essential energy inputs to the building and operation of renewable energy generators. In other words, they don't count the mining, they don't count the transportation of those raw materials to wherever they're going, they don't count the building of the manufacturing and processing plants for these things, they don't count any of that, okay? Like, they only did half the homework, less than half of it. Okay. Other studies draw a wider boundary that includes additional factors such as energy storage, which yields a lower energy profit ratio. Renewable energy EROI pessimists argue that when modeling a global energy transition, the widest possible boundaries should be used. Indeed, EROI pessimists would likely consider even the low EROI scenario of the energy requirements study to be unrealistic because it assumes rising EROI figures for renewable energy technologies, which it probably won't be rising, okay? Would the EROI figures for renewables really improve as the depletion of high-grade deposits of minerals and metals forces manufacturers of low-carbon infrastructure to expend more energy in mining and refining? On the other hand, renewable energy EROI optimists point to the recent history of falling costs for most of the technologies associated with renewables and argue that further efficiency improvements are inevitable, especially if resource constraints can be kept in check by substituting common minerals for ones that are growing scarce. Hope and wish, right? We all have our dreams. The two studies do agree on some general points. The energy transition will require a significant expenditure of energy. This will have implications for the overall economy. In general, energy will tend to be more expensive during the transition, though how much is unclear. So go build your brick cooking pit in the back because you're going to need it. The energy transition will generate extra carbon emissions. How much is unclear. The faster the transition, the more wrenching it is likely to be for society. Therefore, starting sooner is better. That's because as the EROI of fossil fuels inevitably declines, which it's going to, folks, everything we do that depends on fossil fuels will get harder and more expensive. It's not the government doing it, okay? We don't live on a la-la land planet. It's finite. Including the construction of renewable energy infrastructure. Ideally, we should have started the energy transition decades ago. Now that would have been better. I agree. But we still would have had to completely revamp our society so that we're not, digging up, transporting, manufacturing so much renewable equipment that we're providing energy for sports stadiums and casinos and luxury hotels, and you get the drift. Okay, those are unnecessary. Humans don't have a right to destroy the earth for this stuff, these activities. Okay? We don't. You can have fun in other ways in your backyard. Where was I? Ideally, we should have started the energy transition decades ago when energy usage was lower and we had both higher EROI fossil fuels and a larger carbon budget. Those who seek to delay the transition, as the fossil fuel industry has done, are making matters much worse for society. Higher energy usage for non-transition purposes makes the transition more difficult. Because the energy transition will itself require a great deal of energy, both society's total energy demand and its carbon emissions will increase during parts of the transition, unless energy usage for normal operations like transportation, manufacturing, can be curtailed. In the best case scenario, the energy transition is certainly possible if problematic, but well-meaning organizations promoting the notion of green growth may be encouraging unrealistic expectations, you think, given the costs and constraints outlined above. In the worst case scenario, the pathway to the maintenance of industrial civilization narrows considerably. Indeed, if the conclusions of dynamic energy return are correct, a successful transition will probably require fundamental changes not just in industries, but in our economic system as well. And the latter would have significant political implications, in parentheses, the Yellow Vest movement and the Canadian truckers' protests offer only faint hints of what could be in store, because people won't go for this. In all scenarios, some degree of shared effort and sacrifice will be needed throughout society during the transition. Although reducing energy consumption for normal societal operations appears to be a key to the success of the transition, there is still relatively little discussion along those lines among national and global policy makers. That's understandable given that economic growth requires more energy, and politicians have learned that the pro-growth policies are the key to winning elections. This is why climate discussions among political leaders quickly turn away from the subject of limiting consumption and toward carbon offsets and emissions reductions targets that are merely aspirational and that have failed to rein in the fossil fuel dependency and global warming. It's also why climate activist Greta Thunberg characterizes most global climate policy discussion as blah, blah, blah. Energy transition modeling is complicated and imperfect, but its conclusions so far should be an urgent wake-up call for policymakers everywhere. Hello, Washington, Geneva, and Beijing. Is anyone listening? Again, that's Richard Heinberg. I was wondering if they could have a description. You can look up his name, and I'm going to put down this. If you go to resilience.org, he has a lot of articles on there. You go to like archives, and you can see a lot of his articles on resilience.org. Yeah, I mean, he's laying out here and comparing. I mean, they do bring up in a few analyses here, the few sentences, how, we are limited in what it would take, the raw materials it would take to build out renewable infrastructure or the equipment for that, and to modify or update the electrical systems all around the world. I mean, come on, really? It's like starting all over, almost. It really is. It's like starting all over. You are going to try to use less fossil fuels in doing all of this, but that nobody will. We're still going to be flying the butts of athletes all over. Private jets are still going to be flying to the Super Bowl. People are still going to be buying, frivolous, stupid stuff. People are going to be throwing out their clothes and going to buy new clothes instead of keeping them or buying secondhand. I mean, I really should find an article on the textile industry so I can show people just how destructive it really is. People think, oh, I have to live. Oh my God, how am I going to live? You got to remember, Homo sapiens have been on the planet for 1 million years. And of course, there are variations on that. Homo sapiens sapiens is who we are. There were a few other branches that came along the way, but Homo sapiens sapiens have been around for 200,000 years or more. So we are spoiled rotten in the way that we think we need to live. Look at my kitchen. I mean, if I don't live at least halfway, I don't even know if it's halfway, it's probably less than that, like most people, I think my daughters would refuse to come and see me. Which, daughters don't come very often anyway, but I mean, they do what they can because they're busy. They have their dreams and their plans. And I have 2 grandchildren, but like if I went to live in the woods in a makeshift hut somewhere, what would I do? What would happen as far as my loved ones? Would they ever come to see me? I doubt it because they don't understand. And I am a pescatarian. I do eat fish here and there, but it's not about what one person does. I mean, if you want to do things to help, fine, do it because it makes you feel better. But it is the system we are living in. Now, that is what Capricorn is. It's the system that organizes society because, first of all, you really need some kind of system. If there's going to be 8 billion of us, I mean, we have different systems in different countries, but in general, the workings of our world economy are pretty much the same. Everything pretty much turns on the US dollar, which I just listened to a video from Professor Black on YouTube today. And he is, and I've been reading this for since I don't know, 2010, the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, and there's another one. They're working to get off the dollar as a global currency. So, and that's really going to town right now. I mean, there's workings right now, that are happening where the US dollar probably will not be the common monetary unit that the world uses and bases everything on. When that happens, forget about it. We're going to be in a world of hurt, and it's only a matter of time. Astrologically, with Pluto coming to the very, very, very end of Capricorn, and it will be there at 29 degrees very soon, within, what is it, a month or two, and we start to go in Aquarius, remember, we're going to get an intimation of what Pluto in Aquarius is going to be up until June. A complete remaking of how we think of our species. Being Aquarius, being the sign that uses humans as its symbol, okay? The man pouring out the water or the knowledge to humanity, to the rest of his species. That, to me, is each of us has his or her own knowledge. Each of us is important in the making of how we want our world to be. Now, I'm saying there's not going to be much of a world to be, but if you want to do your best to try to keep pounding away at making things better, learn as much as you can, stop living in a world that's status quo and taking status quo information. You need to dig, you need to find deep-rooted facts underneath the delusions that mainstream media and the politicians are telling us. Is this a conspiracy that I'm talking about? It doesn't have to be. This is just the way our society has been for hundreds of years. You know, the top wants us to believe a particular scenario or a particular paradigm, but you have to be able to look underneath and sort it out. In other words, right now, they are, and there's another article that I was reading the other day about all the new ways they're making they're making nuclear power plants. That's going to be another really big issue that I'm going to cover. Do you want one of those in your backyard? It's not like, we all think, oh, we're free, we're in a democracy. You're not. You might vote for this politician who says this and says that, but his words don't explain what he really means or she really means. That they're going to put nuclear power plants all over the place. And you're like, oh, well, what am I going to do about it? That's the problem. We are not taking control over our own lives in the sense that we think that those at the top know what they're doing and they're going to take care of us like daddy. Well, they're not. They're just taking care of themselves. They know what the issues are. They're not telling people below. You have to find that out for yourself. You have to take responsibility and start reading and learning. Nuclear power plants are coming. They're building them. Where are they putting them? Find out for yourself. This is part of Neptune and Pisces. That whole pulling the veil over everyone's eyes, and that commercial advertising kind of psychology, subliminal messaging, all of that they've been using for decades now by that guy Edward Bernays or whatever, who came up with, oh, I know how to pull the wool over everyone's eyes, and you can use it in advertising and you'll make a lot of money. Well, this is what they're going to be doing, and this is what they're doing in general, but specifically they're going to be doing that with nuclear power plants. When they go to your neighborhood or your region and they're going to try to talk your community into allowing a nuclear power plant to come to where you live. What are you going to do about that? And what are we going to do about all the other nuclear power plants that are already here? Are we going to work to get them decommissioned? I mean, we really don't even know if we have time to decommission them all together, all the way down. But we need to start. Decommissioning means making them not just turned off, but taking care of the fuel that's there so that it's safely as possible put away and taken out of commission so that the worst cannot happen. So with that, I think I'll say good night, and thank you for listening to Astrologer Climate Witness on YouTube. I'll be back, and anyone who wants to enjoy some conversation, feel free to make some comments, positive or negative.